Perfect. Sorry about that, guys. So U.S. seafood is in a state of flux. I don't have to tell everybody that, again, things like trade war, you thought I was going to put COVID-19 first. Don't worry, that's second. Things like the executive seafood order that Paul mentioned. So right, it's not all just about kind of negative impacts, but potential support or changes to policy. And of course, we can't sidestep climate change in this discussion of our global food system, where seafood is a part of that for sure. And while I'm only going to highlight 2 things on this list today, and there's a suite of other ways of which seafood is in flux in the United States, but these are kind of the ones that have themes within my research and certainly linkages across. But today I'm going to focus on COVID-19 and the EO due to the kind of attention and the immediacy. But certainly the kind of things that we're going to talk about today are not just pertinent for these aspects, and it's actually kind of this long-term planning perspective, something again that Paul mentioned. And the way I'm going to talk about it today is relative to the resilience action cycle. So this is just how I'm going to frame the talk today, very much in line of thinking about how do you build in resilience to the seafood sector. The resilience action cycle is nice because, you know, we can pick a multitude of different stressors that we're thinking about, and it kind of fits within this framework, whether it's a certain aspect of the supply chain or the supply chain in general, or wild ecosystems in that as well. We can think about it in this type of way where we have this kind of reactive space that responds to some sort of disruption through absorption, reaction, restoration, that then eventually, hopefully, we move into this preventative action cycle where we learn from what we did and then build in robust cycles. And notice on this, a really important aspect is that it doesn't immediately go back to the original state, right? The arrow's kind of offset because the idea is we slightly modify to be a little bit more resilient, and that cycle continues. And so while we're going to use COVID-19 as this kind of really awful, but certainly natural based impact and shock to the system as a potential experiment to understand these cycles in a very large scale way. And so thinking about other stressors certainly applies to this as well. And this will become more clear as we go through the second half. But let's use COVID-19 as an example here, especially because, again, Paul brought that up. So where are we right now in the United States on this reaction cycle? So let's start on the disruption and reaction side. I think we all can agree that COVID has been disruptive, whether it's seafood or otherwise. But again, it's important to note that disruptions are actually quite common in the food sector, including global fisheries and global aquaculture. So this is a paper published by my current postdoc, Rich Cottrell, where he evaluated the global shocks, AKA disruptions, across the time series of both global fisheries and global aquaculture, as you're seeing here. And the general trend that we're seeing is that those shocks are increasing over time. So things that we can learn from things like COVID-19 can really help prepare us for that higher level of disruption and variability that we're pretty much anticipating to increase over time. But caveats, COVID-19 is absolutely unique when we're talking about disruptions. It's not like your typical shock to the system that we see a lot of the time. In fact, it's what we consider a black swan event. It's so large, it's so rare, and it's so expansive that it really encompasses a massive disruption across every single facet of the supply chain. And so really trying to understand that and untangle it, as many have noted, this is going to be a long time coming and understanding the full extent, but we still need to get real-time indicators, or at least shorter timescales, to understand what these feedbacks are and potentially move forward. So I'm going to go through and show you some of the work that we've been trying to implement to understand these responses in a more rapid pace to help make decisions for people like Paul and people at the state level as well, when we're thinking about building in that next phase of the reaction cycle. So I'm going to walk through pieces of the supply chain, hopefully representing a bit of everything and providing new insights into indicators that perhaps maybe you all have not seen before. So I'm going to start on the restaurant side, so the consumer side, especially because 65% of US consumers spend their money at the restaurant. So the impact to to economics here for the seafood industry, massive. So I'm going to show you two types of things that we've looked into. By no means is that comprehensive, but it's one that are allowing us to see some of these responses play out. So I'm going to show you the Google search trends, and then I'm going to show you foot traffic data that's specific to the United States. And the reason we were using these two things is because it's really comprehensive across the United States. We're using the power of global access to something like Google. So what you're looking at here, you're going to see a few figures like this. I'm going to walk you through it. Google standardizes trends relative to different sections of search abilities within the Google platform. And so what you're looking at here is a scale from 0 to 10. It's just how they standardize it, of searches in the food and service search component for seafood restaurants. You're looking at the 2020 trends in aqua, and then previous 4 years in 2016 through 2019, from January to mid-August. And of course, when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic, as an indicator of kind of where you are in this time frame. So first things to kind of take away from this initial search of seafood restaurant is that we actually see a gradual decline happening well before the World Health Organization designated it as a global pandemic, and before we actually saw our first verified case within the United States. So we were actually seeing these impacts that's likely linked to kind of how COVID-19 moved across the planet, starting in places in Asia and China with huge trade partners. So this could be an artifact of that, or kind of people realizing what was coming. But also interesting, we actually see a return to comparable levels from previous 4 years. And so we do see some restoration happening here in those searches. When we compare that to something like grocery stores, so if we look at foot traffic, so this is just normalized foot traffic data, don't pay too much attention on the absolute values, but instead on the trends. Again, kind of same time period, we're looking at that aqua for 2020 and the gray for 2019. So if we look at this, these are things like open markets, seafood markets, any grocery stores that have seafood counters, looking at the kind of purchasing that happens, again, across the suite of the United States. We see a somewhat similar trend as the restaurant searches, but in fact, a much more drastic decline closer to that WHO declaration of pandemic. So it drops really suddenly. We have some sort of bounce back, but we see kind of a more sustained reduction. So what does this mean as we're moving forward? Where was this kind of offset, or was it? And in fact, we can kind of move beyond just the consumer markets, start looking at kind of changes in distribution patterns here by looking at things like searches for seafood delivery and seafood recipes. So those are the two that you're looking here. Again, the Google Trends going from 0 to 100. Now notice the upticks after that dotted red line, not as large as the declines, but we do see a somewhat sustained increase in offset. And could this be the equivalent amounts based on kind of the things that Paul's saying? Probably not, but we do see kind of the shift. So what this means in terms of the 63% of seafood being consumed at home, how much has that increased? These are things that people beyond just the circle of people I work with are trying to look into now to see what does this mean on top of kind of the change in composition of these, right? A lot of people talking about differences in fresh seafood versus frozen seafood, the kind of composition, how local. So all of those aspects are being, or at least attempting to be disentangled at, say, the state level up to the national level and global trends as well. And to kind of end this portion of the reaction cycle, I want to end on the businesses themselves. So the actual producers, the processors, the people working in this. And I'm actually going to highlight work that I did not do, but that people at Virginia Tech put forward, where they implemented a survey of about of 600 and 300 people. Well, those were the respondents anyway in the Q1 and Q2. And this is specific for aquaculture. And what they found was nearly all of the respondents from this report reported being impacted in some way, whether that was lost contracts or layoffs or just modifications to how they operate that impact ultimately their economic prospects. But really interesting to that, in that same kind of vein of the Q2 people that responded, the 300 people that responded in April to June, said only half of them had actually applied for support. And what they noted was across the board, in terms of what was important to keep them afloat, they voiced federal assistance. So the federal kind of coordination of things ended up being, bar none, the most important things, at least designated by the respondents. State was certainly there, but in the end, the federal government kind of took front and center within this discussion, at least in this survey. And that's notable given kind of the responses for, say, funding for businesses and relief. CARES Fund, while there were attributes that were designated for fisheries and aquaculture, it's a very small amount relative to the full pile. Buyback programs were implemented as well, but from what we could tell, it was less than 1% of the annual production. And that's not to say that's the end all. A lot of people had designated that they had applied for other things like PPP or any sort of insurance-based buybacks or coverage. But overall, again, federal assistance was really important in that cycle. So that's a very quick overview of some of the things that we're pulling out, of trying to identify these quick indicators to understand where we are on this reaction cycle in the United States. And it looks like, based on the evidence that we're seeing so far, we're still here. This is not to say that we're not going to come over that hump, we are, but it's notable that we're still here while looking at other countries and seafood sectors. They've kind of moved beyond that while we're still kind of sitting here. So let's talk about more kind of positive aspects, and let's talk about then the learning and rebuilding robustness side of this. And actually kind of thinking about that federal connection of how important seafood is, or where is it in kind of the psyche of how we move forward and structure a more resilient seafood sector within the US. So in fact, not just thinking about it in COVID, but as Paul had previously said, the federal government is very much thinking about seafood and how to modify how we focus our efforts there. And in fact, when we look at the executive order, it actually came out at one of the lowest points during COVID-19 around May 7th, at least for the indicators that we have and that we identified. And so the executive order came out, not any explicit language in relationship to something like COVID-19, but very much seafood centric. So these things are inherently connected. Broad overview, I'm not going to go into detail because Paul already did that, but largely speaking, deregulation of fisheries and supporting aquaculture reform and growth, especially thinking about offshore production. But the kind of big question here is the how, and a lot of kind of the features that have been discussed already were already highlighted. And so colleagues and I are certainly not the only ones at all, but we're a bunch of academic nerds. So we like to think about these things and how to connect them to past research endeavors across the two sectors. And in doing that, both on the fisheries and aquaculture side, in kind of line of how the executive order talked about the two systems combined, we identified kind of 5 guiding principles that potentially science could help frame in terms of articulating and then potentially implementing this more kind of robust system into the future. So first and foremost, I'm going to walk through 5 of them. I'm only really going to focus on one, but I'll walk through the 5. Make precise and strategic fisheries reform. So very much focusing on quota allocation, types of gears, multi-species fisheries, and not so much the kind of sweeping removal of something like a monument. Science really shows in terms of reducing cost and potentially increasing production, even though that's going to be a challenge because most of our fisheries are already sustainably fished, really focus on those attributes. Integrating fisheries and aquaculture through an ecosystem-based approach. This is the one I'm going to kind of really linger on and close on for the remainder of the few minutes I have. Explicitly address social resistance. This one, which I know Seafood for the Future, Aquarium Pacific knows all too well, certainly Seafood for the Future and nutrition. This social resistance component for the US is a big one. Collection of more comprehensive data around aquaculture. This one I could talk about for hours. I won't, I'll spare you. But this is something that I'm actively researching in right now for a California Sea Grant project. And last but not least, reconciling nationalism with the global market. Seafood is the most traded food commodity on the planet. And so really thinking about how the domestic applications and goals are set relative to acknowledging the fact that trade is such an important part of that process, which obviously the EO addresses to an extent, will be critical. But I'm going to land and end on this particular point because it actually kind of addresses and ties into the other four. So ecosystem approach, this is not a new idea. We are not necessarily brilliant for thinking of it because fisheries and aquaculture in their separate lanes have identified and proposed this type of approach before. This is not something that of recreating the wheel. This is actually just looking at wheels that are already been created and then making a full car out of it. So the whole system for ecosystem approach is recognizing multiple goals of a living marine resource, in this case, our oceans, and seeking out alignment across sustainability measures for the objectives of both the fish and farm systems. And the kind of unique attribute here is thinking about, well, how do we actively integrate fisheries and aquaculture together for that planning? So spatial planning, that has already been talked about a bit today, is absolutely fundamental and key, especially for the initiation of this type of framework. But it doesn't stop there, right? Sustainability measures have to be identified with the associated stakeholders, with the associated data that you've collected, to identify where your reference points are. What are your goals in meeting the objectives that are set for both systems, both at the environmental, societal, and economic levels? That then allows the system to move into this kind of more holistic development support stage that has been, again, highlighted again, of how important coordination is. Who is going to oversee that? What's that network that's going to identify and monitor and collate all that data for both fisheries and aquaculture to merge together? Obviously, NOAA is pretty well set up to do that. They already do that really, really well for fisheries. And so bringing in aquaculture in a more fuller sense to that would be kind of second nature. And the kind of last component that hasn't really been articulated so much in the aquaculture EAA world, but certainly in fisheries, is using that to then have the adaptive management feedback back into the system. And fun fact, ecosystem approach is not just good for things like COVID-19, but it's, again, good for structural preventions or at least responses to things like climate change. A recent study just came out showing that fisheries that do have some sort of ecosystem-based process or approach to it actually do much better in the long run in running the models forward for climate change. So I will end in that we're still very much in the reactive state of COVID-19, this very black swan event, unique event, but nonetheless, we can learn from it by studying the responses. Fishers, farmers, seafood businesses are absolutely adapting short term. They're in that reactive stage and are really hustling to stay afloat. But in the end, the federal government is really critical and central, especially for that rebuilding part, which obviously the executive order kind of sets it up really nicely, especially for aquaculture. But from our perspective, the ecosystem approach is absolutely going to set it up for more success moving forward and really get us into that, the latter half of the reactive cycle for building in robustness. And so with that, I will thank you.
Holly, thank you so much. It was brilliant. And I hope you can come back around 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time for the breakout sessions. I'm sure a lot of our attendees would like to ask you more questions. They also
Absolutely.
would like for you to bring the guitar behind you.
Yeah, this is the phase of my life where I thought I was cool. Yeah, don't be fooled. Now it's just wall art. But, yeah.
Well, great. Well, we'll see you back here at 4 p.m. Eastern time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Linda.
Thanks, Holly. Well, now it's time for our next break. And so there's a couple things for you. We have Miss Mandy Enright. She is the food and movement dietitian She's known for her fun and flexible approach to maximize our body, mind, and performance. After such a great morning of our symposium, it's time to go over and see Mandy for some stretching exercises that we can all use and learn from, as we are probably all working from home at this time. And so her session is in the sessions for Mandy. And then there's also our expos. If you haven't visited our expos with our sponsored booths, please be sure to stop by and say hello. And please come back here to the main stage at 2:25 p.m. Thank you and enjoy.